Welcome to Amici, news and insights from the New York courts. I'm John Carr. In today's Diversity Dialogue segment, we are honored and delighted to welcome to the program a truly historic figure, the Honorable Milton A. Tingling, the keystone of the nation's first three-generation family of Black judges. The Tingling family history and legacy is truly remarkable. Justice Tingling graduated from law school in 1982, the same year that his father, Milton F. Tingling, was elected to New York City Civil Court. In 1996, he became the first Black person ever elected to the New York City judgeship in a district encompassing Harlem and Washington Heights. In 2000, he was elected to the Supreme Court, and just 2 months after he was reelected in 2014, Justice Tingling stepped down when the Appellate Division First Department appointed him New York County Clerk, Commissioner of Jurors, and Clerk of the Supreme Court. Today, his daughter Asia is a civil court judge. Judge, thank you for coming on the program. We have a lot of ground to cover, and the beginning is usually a good place to start. So let's start there. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Harlem, Washington Heights. Started out on 148th Street between Amsterdam and Convent on the 6th floor of a walk-up. And I have an older sister and a younger brother. And when my younger brother was born, I was 3, my sister was 5. And so my parents sent me to South Carolina to live with my mother's mother and her sister. At the time, they couldn't afford all 3 of us. So my sister was starting kindergarten and my brother was a baby, so I got to go. When I came back to New York, my parents had moved to Washington Heights into, of all things, an elevator building. And I will never forget the first day I came back, I got on the elevator and I pushed all the buttons. And I just stayed on the elevator riding from floor to floor for about a half an hour because I never experienced it.
That's a great story. No, so as a young kid, were you somewhat estranged from your family being, I don't know, about 1,000 miles away or so?
Yes, yes, very much so. And it's funny, so many things happen and a lot of things happen and you don't realize them until later on in life. Um, my parents and my sister were the only people I really knew up until I was sent to South Carolina. But going to South Carolina helped form, I realized later, the person that I am and many of the things that I believe in. And interestingly enough, um, that experience exposed me to, because it was South Carolina. So we're talking about legal segregation. Everything was black and white. Blacks lived on one side of the railroad tracks, whites lived on the other. But probably the most amazing thing that happened when I was down there was because blacks were not allowed to swim at the city swimming pool, okay, they actually built a swimming pool for Negroes. And I'm one of the few people that I grew up with in my life that actually knows how to swim.
That's remarkable. I'd never thought about that. And there's a similar story. You may have known him personally, Franklin Williams.
Of course.
And as a child, Franklin had a similar experience. He was hanging out with his friends. They all were all friends. He wanted to go to the public pool, and they let everyone in but him.
Right, right. It's the most amazing thing. And Franklin Williams, truly, one of the great people that I look up to. And he was also very close to my father. So we'll get into that. But through my father, I've actually met so many of the great people in the history of the court system and have been blessed by it totally.
Oh, let's get into that right now, and then we'll catch up where we were.
All
So
right.
your father knew, or did you know Franklin Williams?
Yes, I did. Introduced to him as a young man, and then, of course, became aware of him when they formed the Franklin Williams Commission. But we, they used to have father-son dinners for most of the Black lawyers. And quite frankly, out of all of the sons and daughters, only a few of us actually ended up going into this world. I mean, there was myself, there was Keith Wright, there was David Patterson, um, there was Bailey Jr., whose father had been on the MTA board, and he went into it. And his mother was Cora Walker, who was a very famous Black female attorney. um, who worked for the unions, and she won a few big cases and was well renowned. But out of all of the black lawyers, and I still have some of the pictures from the dinners, um, only a few of us actually went into the legal profession.
That's interesting. And then, so what were your early impressions of Franklin Williams, and what were your father's impressions of him?
Just uh, it's strange looking back on it. As a young man, you don't understand the strength of that generation, the things that they faced, and even if some of them I faced, but to the degree that they faced them, we had no cognizance because in many ways they tried to teach us and protect us from the racism at the same time. My
Hmm.
impression of Franklin Williams was that he was, my father was Jamaican. So there was this strong West Indian who knew who he was, and he was determined to make a difference, even if that difference didn't occur at his time or even in his lifetime. Every journey begins with the first step. And this was a generation dedicated to addressing the issues at the time, but looking forward. A lot of people don't understand the big picture. It's not always about the immediate. And so that was my impression of him. Just a great man.
Well,
Simple.
your father's, you mentioned your father's generation. Your father is admitted, I believe, in 1953, a year before Brown v. Board of Education. He came of age when the Jim Crow era was alive, and I don't know if say well, but alive. And how did that experience must have shaped him, and by extension, you?
Yeah, yeah, very true. It show you how stupid you are as a young person. Um, so, right. So my father gets admitted, and he's there, and my mother, of course, is from South Carolina. So I always said that I'm a product of a mixed marriage, Jamaican and South Carolinian, but that's another story. But he, I didn't understand at the time, but he expressed concerns about us as children being sent to South Carolina, not just when I went to live, but we used to go every summer. My mother was a school teacher, and so they were off for the summer. And so she would take us and we would go to South Carolina, where we knew the racism, we knew the segregation, but in many ways were protected from it. As I said, we had a pool, we had sports, we had neighbors, we had church, but there were places that we couldn't go. For example, Howard Johnson's, which was my favorite restaurant. Howard Johnson's used to have a Friday night fish fry, 99 cents, all you can eat. And I loved it. And so when I went to South Carolina, Friday would come and they'd go, "Where do you want to go eat?" And I would go Howard Johnson's. And they would have to basically segue me to some other place where we could go to eat. So for my father, he was a very stubborn West Indian man, which is probably repetitive, but um, he had a hard time with segregation and racism, a very hard time with it. Um, he always was determined that we should be judged on who we were. My father always taught me that you're not better than anyone else, but you're not less than anyone else. Um, it's really an amazing thing. But when I tell you about how stupid I was, when I got older, I had roommates in college that were all from the South. And I remember the first time I went to visit, they lived in beautiful homes, they had property, they all of this. And I'm 18 years old. I'm the vice president of the Black Students Union. And I had the audacity to go and ask my father, "Yo, Dad, you were smart. Why didn't you move to South Carolina, man? We could have been living in a big house and all the rest of it." My father said, "Well, son, they were lynching people at the time. And I thought it was a better idea. Maybe we should stay here."
Oh, good Lord. So to back up a little bit, when you went to South Carolina, you were how old?
I was 3, came back when I was 7.
Okay. And so what years are we talking?
We're talking 1956, and I came back in 60. When did I come back? Came back in 60.
So by then, Brown v. Board is um, decided, if not exactly accepted.
Right.
Um, but you're still facing segregation.
Oh, without a doubt. And again, one of the things, my mother lived to be 96. And when I speak to students or groups, I always remind them, I said, my mother lived half of her life in legal segregation. You have to understand how important the law is, okay, in terms of addressing issues of bias and segregation and discrimination. The law really is the one thing that has progressed. And without it, I don't believe many things would have happened. Listen, I speak to gangs, okay? I speak to gang members. I speak to people trying to get out. And they talk about discrimination and segregation. And I tell them all, I said, listen, do any of y'all have Scud missiles? What are you doing? You cannot militarily address all of these things. You can't do it by just stocking up on Glocks and MAC-10s. You have to do it within the structure, and the law is the avenue to do it. That's it. And my
Wow,
father
that's
believed that. Yeah.
um. So how did your father coming up in that era? I mean, I go back to that era, and I mentioned earlier that he was admitted before Brown v. Board of Education.
Yes.
He was, I don't know, he's probably 15, maybe 20 when Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier. How does someone in that era and that generation position themselves to become a judge, or even have it in their mind that that's a possibility?
John, and thank you for that question. Um, when I was elected and became a judge, I went to there was a member of my mother's church that had a printing company, and I went to him to print up the invitations. And I'm sitting down talking to him, and he was an elder at the church, and I'd never had this conversation before, but he told me that it wasn't my father's dream to become a judge or whatnot, that it was actually his father's dream that his children and grandchildren would become judges because of the importance that judges had in his native Jamaica. And it was something that he came up with. And I was shocked when Mr. Stevens told me the story. I never knew that it was my grandfather's dream. And he obviously passed it on to my father about becoming a judge. My father always wanted to be a judge. He became a judge late in life. He became a judge when he was 62. Under our Constitution, you have to retire when you're 70 unless you're an elected Supreme Court. And he became a judge when he was 62 and he died right before he turned 67. And people say, oh, wow, he didn't even get the full 8 years and whatnot. But I tell them it was his dream. And when he got it, he was the happiest judge I've ever known, either before or since. He was simply a happy man.
Now that would have been utterly unattainable to your grandfather, I am sure.
Oh, God, yes. Yeah, absolutely.
What did he do?
My grandfather was actually a pharmacist in Jamaica, which in many ways was the equivalent of being a doctor
Mm-hmm.
because it's not like you had doctors on every corner. And he told me that he came to America because his being a pharmacist did not guarantee that his children would be anything. They can end up working in the fields, cutting sugarcane, you know, picking fruit. It didn't guarantee anything. He also had one brother and 10 sisters, all of whom he brought to America. So he came to America in 1918, intending to go to med school and become a doctor. The next year, he sent for my grandmother, who he had only met one time, had been introduced to her family, and he sent for her. She got on a boat and came. They both came through Ellis Island. I have their records. They got married, and a year later, my father was born. So now he had a family, and so he went to work working in the insurance industry, and he worked for a company called Unity Mutual Insurance Company. And they've long since gone out of business, but that's what he did to support his family.
But in many ways, it's a typical immigrant story. The
Oh,
color is different, but other than that, it's just
Oh, it's the standard immigrant story. And the amazing thing is that during that great period of migration, only approximately 120,000 people immigrated from the Caribbean, Bajans, Anguillans, Jamaicans, only about 120,000 out of the millions that came during that era. And most of them came with that same dream. And so many of the ones that I met coming up who were contemporaries of my father who became professionals, doctors, lawyers, bankers, things like that, they all came from that same Caribbean grouping, and they all came with the same mentality that they were coming to build. As you said, it's the typical immigrant story. You come to build your own, but you're building for your family and your future generations.
Of course, what your ancestors dreamt of coming from Jamaica are exactly what my ancestors dreamt of coming from Ireland.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. So,
Who were your early role models? So you were a little kid when Martin Luther King was at his heyday. Oh no, you were starting to come of age. But anyhow, to back up, who were your early role models?
interestingly enough, my father, my father was my early role model. Um, he used to, it's so funny, he used to have this thing that he never made a promise he didn't keep. That's something that he taught me that was very important. And then I think I was, I think I was 13, and I think he promised me something but didn't remember. And I held it over his head for the next 5 years. Yeah, you promised me that. I think it was a bike or something, but I kept it over his head. No, 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 you're not perfect. You do all of that. But interestingly, some of my early role models, um, I remember in 1963, I found out about Nelson Mandela. And it may seem strange at the time, people didn't really know who he was, but just the very thought of being imprisoned at the time, um, and so far away in a place that we had no connection to, was simply amazing to me. Um, I had some incidents of discrimination even as a kid that stuck with me, but at the same time to realize that I had at least an opportunity to go out and do something about it, you know, to address it, made his situation seem even more dire. And that admiration continued up until the time that was released.
Were you race conscious, to put it to coin a term, I guess, early on, or were there incidents that made you conscious of race?
Very race conscious. Well, number one, because of my experience in South Carolina, because it's just like I said, it was legal, so it wasn't like it was hidden. It wasn't like it was subtle, any of that. It was right there. When I was a child and we would go to South Carolina, we used to take the train, and we would take the train right into Chester, a little small town, actually closer to Charlotte, North Carolina, than any big city in South Carolina. And I'll give you one story. I remember when I was 8 years old, I was in the train station, and the train station was, whites only, coloreds only section. And I wanted some water. And I walked over to the water fountain, and my aunt started yelling and screaming at me to get away from there and to come back over. And I got word and I came back over, and she gave me a whipping right there in the train station because I had gone to the whites only fountain. And I didn't, I mean, I could read, but I just wanted some water. I'm not reading this and recognizing it because while it was legally segregated at the time, we they didn't expose us to it all the time. We were protected. Okay. I remember the first time I went to the movies in Chester. Okay. There was a colored section, which was the balcony, and we were not allowed to enter the theater from the front. We had to enter the theater to the balcony from the rear and climb up the fire escape. So, yes, I was very race conscious. When I came back to New York and started going to school, I was fortunate in that I was not in a school that was predominantly one culture, color, or the other. Okay. And my classes were mixed like crazy. Okay. I had black teachers, I had white teachers, I had Jewish teachers, I had Baptist teachers, and that helped me address whatever anger I had over race consciousness because somebody was your friend. It wasn't your white friend or whatnot. They were your friend or they weren't. And so I'm very, very, very lucky. And I give that to my parents. They made sure.
And what school was that?
So I started out at PS 192, and they used to have these different classes. My sister, it was called Special Progress. Mine was called Intellectually Gifted Children. and they were citywide exams that were given. And if you passed, you would go into these special classes. And so I switched schools, ended up going to PS 129 to the IGC class. And what made it special was we were taught a foreign language. Okay. We also had music. Okay. I learned to play the violin from fourth grade through sixth. I studied violin and continued when I ended up going to junior high school, which doesn't exist. And we were taught American history. I mean, it was really exciting. It was very exciting. So, been very lucky. But as I said, my father was a lawyer, my mother was a teacher. And if you'll allow me just a little bit, my mother is really a heroine on her own. She has such wonderful accomplishments, which I was unaware of when I was a child. I really wasn't. My mother graduated with her master's degree from Columbia in 1951.
Wow.
And she graduated when she was pregnant with my older sister. She actually gave birth 1 week after she graduated. It's the most amazing thing. I have her master's degree here. When
It
she,
is one. It must have been extremely rare for a woman to have been in that position at that time, and a black woman.
exactly, and I was totally unaware, John. I tell you, one of my most prized possessions, when my mother graduated from college, she went back to South Carolina and applied for and received her teaching license. I have her teaching license here, and where it says that she is licensed by the state of South Carolina for the teaching of elementary school children, it's crossed out and handwritten in for the teaching of elementary colored children only.
Oh my God.
It sits right here in my office, right here, and I show it to people. So don't complain to me. You know, things have come a long way.
Oh my God. So with your background, your parents' obvious interest in academic matters, the experience you had in the elementary school and in the high school, which seemed to be generally positive in a lot of ways,
Yes.
is that what positioned you to apply to an Ivy League school?
Well, that actually was something different. I'd never heard of Horace Mann. I'd never heard of Horace Mann, but in sixth grade, because we were in this IGC class, and at the time, the city at the time had open enrollment, which meant that once you got your documents, you could go to any junior high school in the city to apply. Okay. And basically, it was almost first come, first served. Okay. So, but what happened was because I was in this IGC class, we were exposed and educated about some of the private high schools: Trinity, Hackley, Horace Mann, Riverdale, Fieldston. And so I heard about Horace Mann and I read the brochure. And John, they had 2 hours of mandatory gym. And so I was like, oh, I got to go here. Because, see, in elementary school, when you screw up and they want to punish you, they don't let you have recess. So you don't get a chance to go out and play handball or whatever or run around.
Oh, but
So,
that never happened to you, did it?
let me say, I still have a red card in my file at PS 129 for when I screwed up. But I ended up getting into and going to Horace Mann. There were it was a class of 106, and there were only 4 black students. It was all male at the time, and there was a dress code, and there were only 4 of us. So, and one of them was with me from elementary school, but I didn't know he was going until we showed up at Horace Mann. So so a lot of the applying. Oh, I'm sorry. So to get to your question, at Horace Mann, let me put you like this. When I graduated, I believe there were 98 people in my class. 92 of them applied to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. Okay. Okay. And 20 of them got into one or more of those schools. Okay.
Wow.
Columbia was your fallback. Okay. And so applying to Ivy League schools that was just standard applying. And I liked Brown. I was interested in it. I took a trip up there with one of my teammates from the football team. Um, we went up there, and Brown had a very interesting dynamic at the time. 10% of the incoming freshman class was reserved for students of color.
Wow. What year? We're talking in 1970s,
Talking
right?
1971,
That must
1971,
have been extraordinarily unusual.
extraordinary unusual. So out of a class of 1,300 incoming, 130 of them were students of color. And so I believe me, I was not alone. And then the other thing was their basketball team. They had a cheerleading squad, and it was all black women. And so I went to a basketball game, and John, they were dancing and swinging and swaying, and I was like, yeah, I want to come here. After 6 years of an all male school, I had to go somewhere. So they got me.
I went to an all male school as well, but
A preaching
um,
choir.
so it's interesting to think of the dominoes in life, and as I get older, I do that too. And the things that wouldn't have happened if something previous had not happened. If you hadn't had the experience you did in grammar school, if that domino hadn't fallen into Horace Mann, and if that domino hadn't fallen into a whole bunch of others, and then Brown, the whole scenario changes. The
Yeah,
whole story changes.
yeah, there's no question. Um, there were there were people that I went to elementary school with um, that fell off the wagon, did not pursue those opportunities. We run the same class, okay, which meant we were exposed to the same thing. I was not the top student in the class. I think I was well rounded, with different things, but I know that many of them never applied to a Brown or to others to even it's a different mentality. My parents will always no, no, no. You never tell yourself no. You let someone else tell you no. But if you tell yourself no, no one else has to. And everybody didn't have that kind of support or mentality. Um, my best friend throughout that entire period, who ended up going to Brown with me, and he was on the basketball team, who ended up doing just fabulously for himself. He was he was one of two children with a single mother who worked as a student aide at our elementary school. Okay, they didn't have all of that, but she was one of those mothers who was like, no, education, education, education. And so when you talk about the dominoes, I've been blessed. I always told people that the first great decision I ever made was being born to my parents. Right, it was my decision, right?
Very good decision. So then you graduate from Brown,
Yeah,
and was it always your intention to go to law school?
no, I had no intention of going to law school. I hated law. My father was a lawyer, which, oh my God, your father being a lawyer, when a parent is a lawyer, it either makes you want to go or it makes you want to run away from it entirely because it colors so much of how they raise you, your interactions, your conversations, the logic, okay, where they sit there and they out logic you. It's very frustrating. So I wanted nothing to do with the law, nothing whatsoever. So that was that.
So in your household, was your father the court of last resort, or was your mother the court of last resort?
My parents were old school, so whatever disagreements or other stuff they had, it took place in their bedroom behind closed doors. Okay. And I learned later on, my father would be the one to deliver the news, but my mother had a lot of decisions that she made, which she informed me about later.
So why North Carolina Central School of Law?
I had been, at this point, I'd been out of school. I didn't go straight through school. I actually left Brown after my junior year, got married. I had set up a program where I only needed 4 more credits. And so I was working and going to City College at night. And I got the 4 credits. I sent them back up to Brown pursuant to their protocols. I went back up to go to graduation. I went to the registrar's office to make sure everything was straight. And they said, Milt, it's so great to see you. Where have you been? And I said, well, I've been on this program. I already completed my major. And the school allows you to just do the extra credits and send them in. So she says, well, we have you listed as left school, no explanation. I'm like, what? I said, well, I'm going to go see Dean Brown, who I set it up with. And they said, there's a problem. Dean Brown had a massive stroke and he's in a convalescent home in California and all of his files have been sealed. And I had to go home and tell my father I wasn't graduating. That wasn't easy. But I was going to be the first one in my family to graduate in 4 years. We had graduates, but the first one. So I had to tell him, but I was very mature about it, John. So I decided I was going to show them, I decided I'm not going back to school. Very mature. So
Hmm.
I spent the next few years. Oh my God. I was driving a cab. Oh God, I was selling good humor ice cream. I went to work for the IRS. So then eventually, I think it was a year and a half, maybe two, I just decided to go back and do the 4 credits at Brown. And that was it. And then
Now,
after that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think I skipped ahead a little bit. So last we heard in this conversation, you wanted nothing to do with law. So
Nothing.
how come you're applying to law school? You
I
didn't like being a cab driver or a good humor man?
Yeah, well, it wasn't a lot of, listen, I drove in the day where we used to get paychecks. We used to get a paycheck at the end of the week based on what it is you brought in. So, today everything is individual contractors. You lease the cab, okay? They don't care if you make a penny or not. You pay them up front, okay? Where in the old days you did the meter, you got a paycheck, they took out Social Security, they took out taxes. No. So today they're all independent contractors. But over that period of time, um, I decided that I wanted to go to law school because it was going to be best for my family. After I'd gone back to Brown and come back, I bounced around doing different things. And I decided to apply to law school. And the other thing was I had my daughter. I had my daughter. So that made a big difference.
And necessity being the mother of invention.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so the thing about I got into New York Law School and I was working for the Transit Authority as a token booth collector. And I got into New York Law School. I could have gone there during the day and worked during the evening, but there was some things with my wife and she wanted to leave. And so I applied to North Carolina Central. And John, tuition was for an out-of-state student was $2,500 a year. In-state tuition was $500 a year, and they gave me $1,000 scholarship. So goodbye, I'm going.
That sounds like a good reason. So then you get out of law school, and then I believe you clerked for, I don't know, a few judges
I
in
did.
Harlem before going into practice by yourself. Is that correct?
Well, I clerked for two. The year I came out, my father got elected, and one of the people he got elected with was a gentleman named Milton Richardson. So he got elected, and I actually found out I passed the bar the same day my father was having his party, his ceremony. So of course we go, and my father's like, "Oh, it's my son. He passed the bar. He needs a job." So he's trying to get it. So he's all of this. So Judge Richardson said, "Well, come in, have an interview." I went in and interviewed. He had someone else who he was going to hire, but that person never showed up, and so he ended up hiring me. And then he and I became like father and son. He had no children, so I mean, just wonderful. And after about 4 years, he told me it was time for me to leave, that I needed to grow. And so I then went to work for a judge named Dennis Edwards Jr. And Dennis Edwards Jr. was a historical who nobody really knew about. In 1948, Dennis Edwards Jr. Was appointed as a Supreme Court law secretary, okay, to a judge in Brooklyn. He was the only Black Supreme Court law secretary in the entire city of New York. And he got it through politics. He spent 43 years in the court system, whereas Milton Richardson had never worked for government until he became a judge. He had been in private practice. So I saw both sides of it. So Dennis retired and I went into private practice. Interestingly enough, I got an office from a man who had ran against my father for a judgeship in 1978 and beat him. And he had retired and he gave me my first office and sent me my first client.
So what year are we talking about now? Roughly 1980?
We're talking 1988,
1988.
right?
Okay. So at that point, you're a black man with a solo practice. Who are your clients? Are your clientele primarily black or not?
Yes, primarily Black, and they are coming to me through contacts. There's something today which is almost a lost cause. It's what I call people law. Somebody's in an accident. Somebody has a contractual dispute. Someone has a landlord-tenant issue. Someone has an issue with the cleaners. Someone has an issue with the bank. Okay, or they have a criminal case. This is when I grew up. These are the lawyers that I knew. They had private practices. They weren't corporate. Maybe they couldn't get in. They weren't necessarily government. Okay. And that is what, and I would tell you something, I loved it. I loved it. It's one of the great experiences of my life. Just loved it. Yeah. My
Well,
office would,
in that context, a lawyer is a problem solver, and you're solving problems in a community you're familiar with, right?
yeah. And my office was right next to the Apollo. I got to look out my window and see all of 125th Street and everything that was going on. Like I said, it was just wonderful. Didn't make a lot of
Did,
money, but I loved it.
did you experience racism early in your career as a lawyer?
Absolutely.
In what
Absolutely.
form? In what way?
It's almost a standard story in some ways that doesn't go on. When you go into a courtroom, the front row is reserved for attorneys. And I remember the first time I went in on a criminal case, and I went and I sat there, approached by a court officer, and didn't ask, was told, excuse me, you can't sit there. This is for attorneys. I'm dressed in a suit. I've got a briefcase. Why would you presume I'm not? Okay, there's that type of thing. And it continues. The problem is some of it is so subtle, and it's not that people are doing it intentionally. They don't know they're doing it intentionally. But if you don't know you're doing it, how do you rectify it? One of the things as a lawyer, yes, and definitely as a judge, one of the things that used to gripe me was I would have, first of all, there are very few attorneys of color in Supreme Court. Very few attorneys of color in Supreme Court. Criminal, yes. Civil, absolutely not. And what would happen is, like, for example, I might be hearing something on a motion, and invariably, if I had two white attorneys on a big case, one of them would always say this: "Well, Your Honor, this is a very difficult case, and it's very hard to follow." And I'm sitting there like, "Why are you opening up with that? Like, I'm
Mhm.
incapable of learning or following." So what they didn't know was that I always read the papers ahead of time, and I would always ask them a question once they started speaking. So
But they presumed that you were not their intellectual equal.
absolutely, it's so patently obvious, John, and that's just it.
Now,
So,
those sort of experiences have to shape you as a man, as a lawyer, as a judge. How does it affect the type of judge that you became, you grew into?
well, what it did for me was this: like people say, "Oh, well, they don't respect me." You don't command respect; you earn respect. Okay, that's one thing that my parents, my ancestors taught me. You earn respect, and so when it says, "How did you shape you?" It made me always wanting to make sure that what was being done to me did not inform my decisions. Okay, so that if I felt I was being insulted or discriminated against or biased or whatnot, I did not let that inform my decision. Okay, I didn't take that and be like, I'm going to show this person, how dare they do that. One of my rules for being a judge was every case, I don't have a policy. Every case is its own case because every case involves a different person. It can be the same set of facts, but every case involves a different person. So when you say how did it shape me? It made me even more intent on not letting what other people do control me.
Did you have judicial role models, federal and state, at that time?
Oh yes. Um, Thurgood Marshall was always somebody, but then George Bundy Smith, George Bundy Smith, just I knew him from the time I was a child. Just a just a wonderful intellectual, um, so brilliant. What a remarkable story. Him, his twin sister, being the only black students at Yale Law School in their class, having been arrested, having been convicted during the civil rights marches of the '60s, having had his conviction vacated by the Supreme Court of the United States, which allowed him to become a lawyer, to get admitted, because he was convicted of a felony. He couldn't have been admitted in the state of New York. You know, just a remarkable man. And in addition, to this day, I can think of no other jurist that was so involved in his community. The man was on every board, every committee, every PTA, every tenant association. I don't know how he did it. I really don't. It's just remarkable. And then there was another judge later on in my career, a Judge Marks. And when Judge Marks retired, he dedicated his life to addressing wrongful convictions. And I always just looked up to him. You know, what a remarkable man. What a remarkable
Uh,
man vision.
what was his first name, Judge Marks?
I believe it was Richard. It wasn't the Marks that just left. It was an old one. Spelled it with an X, Marx. Yeah,
Okay,
just
okay,
remarkable. Not
okay.
Larry. Yeah.
Now, you served in Supreme Court for about 14 years, I guess,
Yep.
and much of that time overlapped with my time with the New York Law Journal. Two decisions kind of stand out to me. One shot down Mayor Bloomberg's attempt to bar food service establishment from selling large sugary beverages,
Right.
and another put an end to the practice of shackling youths being transported to family court.
Yeah.
In both cases, what stands out to me is you sided with the individual against the might of government.
Yeah.
What should I read into that?
Well, you would have to read a couple of my other decisions when I sided with government. I tell you what was funny when when the soda case came up, I had all the parties in, and I told them one of the amicus was by the NAACP of the state of New York, and I belong to a local NAACP chapter, and I told them, I said, listen, I belong to the local chapter. I'm not a member of the litigant, and I said, I'm not a lifetime member. I said, but I'm telling you all of this to give all of you the opportunity to file a motion for me to recuse, and I will address it. Okay? Nobody filed the motion, and the city eventually told me they didn't file the motion because of an earlier decision I had made when I sided with the city. So they figured I was going to go with the city. It was a case where the city, it had to do with vendors in Central Park, and the city had set up a new program where it was basically like a cattle stampede to Parks headquarters to get one of the 100 different licenses that they would give out daily. And you had to stay in a specific spot that was marked by a medallion at certain spots, both in and along the sidewalks of the park. And the vendors had brought a lawsuit on various grounds, and I ended up siding with the city. It was appealed, and I was affirmed. And so I believe the city thought that I was basically a government man. So there we
Well,
go.
as you said earlier, you took every case as it come in, and every case was to an extent an island. I understand every case is governed by precedent and and other things, but that illustrates to me what you said earlier about treating each case as an individual matter.
It's a different thing. You can have in criminal court. I sat in criminal my first few years, which I call was during Giuliani time, and I mean people were being brought in. Oh, you wouldn't believe they resurrected every municipal ordinance you could ever think of. Do you know it was illegal to wear miniskirts? There was still a law in the book from the 1700s about the length above the knee. People brought in front of me. I remember there was a delivery guy who was arrested because his bicycle didn't have a bell. Okay, that was a violation. It was illegal to ride your bike through Washington Square Park, but the no bike riding signs were hidden behind an array of flowers. We used to have people brought in because they'd be sitting reading the newspaper in a park, in a part of the park that was reserved for children. That was a violation of park rules and constituted a Class C misdemeanor.
Wow.
And you could be arrested. We had people with the open container, all kinds of things. And there was a lot of racism there in how it was applied. And that was the big difference. So those decisions about every case, you could have someone who's reading the New York Times totally innocently. Why are they getting a record? Okay. And then you could have someone else who was in there for the wrong purposes. Okay. So, like I said, every case is its own case. It's not about the charges. And the most overused part of CPLR and CPL is in the discretion of the court. Judges have wide and varied discretion, okay? Because quite frankly, if we didn't, what do we need judges for? Just plug it
Mhm.
into a computer and you'll get a result.
With artificial intelligence, that may happen someday.
Exactly, exactly. So it's
So,
coming.
why did you leave all the trappings of being a Supreme Court judge to become a county clerk?
Well, you know, you know, I got reelected to my last 14 years on November 7th, 2014. I had been working on it for 2 years because, quite frankly, I plan to retire the next year and just move. But I would have had my 30 years in. I would have been grandfathered into Social Security, and I would have left. But a number of circumstances came up. Um, number of circumstances came up, and I actually the county leader asked me to put my name in until he found a good candidate. So I put my name in, but I have a rule. One of my rules is make friends, not enemies. You don't have to make enemies. You already have them. You don't have to make them. Okay.
It's a great rule.
So anyway, so I go to the interview. I have no intentions of doing this, but I go up there and basically I know everybody at appellate division. I knew them or they knew my father, and everybody's like, oh, this is great. Right? They didn't have to make a decision. The next thing I know, they're calling me, telling me, you got it. And I'm like, but I didn't want it. Okay, but I got it. I don't know what to do. So um, the other thing was I did my research, and there had never been a black county clerk in 235 years and 62 counties. There had never been a black county clerk in the entire state of New York. There had never been a black commissioner of jurors in the entire same period, state of New York. There had never been a clerk of Supreme Court, same period, same time. And so one of the things that my mentors taught me was you always have to let your people, your people know that these things are possible. And the fact that it was going to be the first and had never been done. And I was succeeding a man who'd been here 45 years. Okay. It
Norman
led,
Goodman.
yeah, Norman. And it led me to, I actually had somebody tell me, someone I truly respected, tell me I had to do it. I had to do it. And do you know what's the most amazing thing, John? I actually had to count on my fingers. It seems like yesterday. On Monday began my 10th year on this job. That's right.
Wow,
I've
it's
been
been
here
that long.
9 years. I know. I couldn't believe it
Wow.
myself. Couldn't believe it myself.
Wow.
January 1st, 2015.
A few years ago, Jay Johnson, the former U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security, issued a report finding that the New York State court system remains infected with racism to the extent that there is a, quote, second class system of justice for people of color, close quote. Did that come as a surprise to you in any way?
No, not at all. In practice, I'd been to all the courts. I had the opportunity to sit in criminal, in civil. I did cases, I did trials in family. And what he was talking about when you talk about second class, I referenced earlier that you see very few people of color in civil Supreme Court. Okay. And so much of the assets and um, so much of the innovation and technology goes into civil Supreme Court, which is really about money. People of color are basically in criminal court, they're in civil court with landlord tenant, and they're in family court. Okay. And that is where you have these two tiered systems of justice. There is a lack of uniformity in many ways throughout the state. When you read the Commission on Judicial Conduct reports every year, some of the stuff you read and you're like, I don't believe this. You don't believe this still goes on. But we in New York tend to forget this is a big state, okay? And it's a lot of differences all throughout the state. So Jay Johnson's report was crucial that it had to be said. Some people tried to use it and misinterpret it, okay, which was wrong from my opinion. But being surprised, absolutely not. Live it every day.
If there has been progress, the
Absolutely.
less than a year ago, Judge Rowan Wilson became the first chief judge of color in the history of the state. What does that say about the progress? Is that something you could have imagined when you started practicing law?
Oh God, no. I mean, for the generation before me, I had the same feeling that when Obama was elected president. I'm going to say I use the word blessed because I know that I am. I've been blessed to have a a a wonderful professional and personal relationship with our new chief judge, and it has been it it's a blessing because it's him. And when you get to know this man intellectually, he's without peer. He simply is. he's without peer. But as a person and what it is he wants to try and accomplish, is so God, it's so heartwarming. It's like for me, it's a final cap on my career. I honestly think that if this hadn't happened, I'd be looking to leave. But he told me I can't go. So I keep telling him, man, you can't tell me what to do. But hey, he does anyway. So he's told me I'm hanging around until he tells me I can leave.
This is a very exciting time for the courts. Very
Oh, it
exciting, I
is,
think.
John. It truly is.
Mm.
Yeah, and what he's doing and the team that's been put together, and they've only been there 8 months, and so many things have happened, and so many more things on their plate. There's so many huge decisions coming up this year that people aren't aware of. Everybody knows about the redistricting, but what about right to shelter? What about the New York City tax scheme, which is also up? You're going to have congestion pricing. God forbid, you're going to have all the Trump appeals. Okay, there are so many things that are on their plate of significance and the effect and ramifications, not just locally, but statewide and nationally. And then, of course, internationally, depending on what happens with the redistricting.
Mm.
That is incredible. But let me say that Judge Rowan D. Wilson is the man, the right man for the time. And I'm blessed to know him the way that I do.
Yes, you are. Let's turn back to you. Tell me about your wife, Lisa, and is it 5 children?
Oh God, yeah, yours, mine, and ours. So I have my oldest daughter. I've been married 3 times. So I have my oldest daughter from my first wife, who's the judge, Asia. Then I have my 2 sons with my second wife, and she had a daughter who I adopted and raised. And then with Lisa, she had a grown daughter who I've taken in as because she didn't have a father in her life. So I've taken her in as my daughter, making me crazy. But as far as my wife, Lisa, um, I'm just, I was done. I wasn't looking, and she just showed up, and she got me. I told her I tell everyone she stalked me until she finally got me. But I usually get a smack in the back of the head. But I think that I have a certain amount of experience and wisdom, but she is absolutely brilliant and it's so interesting. She's eclectic in what her interests are, whether it's art or the law or oh my God, just procedure, whether it's cooking or anything. So she's brought a whole new phase into my life, and again, I'm very lucky man, very
I'm
very
glad.
lucky.
I'm happy for you. You mentioned Asia. So how did it feel to watch your daughter take the oath of office as, I think, first a city court judge and now a family court judge?
Civil court judge. She was assigned to family court, so she's elected to civil court. Um, one of the things when I was first elected to civil, it's the largest non-county district in the city, and I was the first black ever to run, and obviously the first one ever to win. And now, all these years later, that's the seat that she holds. So watching her, thinking about my father and how proud he would have been, because none of the other grandchildren were alive when he died. I'm sorry, my one of my nephews, but he was like 2. Um, it made me think about my father, how happy he would have been, but it also made me think about my grandfather, about his dream of generations. And we research it and we ask all the time, but to our knowledge at this point, we are the only 3 generation black family of judges in the history of the nation.
So your father's American or your grandfather's American dream has come true, maybe more so than he could have imagined.
I know, I know. And now my youngest son just graduated law school from Central. He's in North Carolina and he's awaiting admission to the bar. So might get another one. See what happens.
That would be fantastic. Now, I know you've been very active with a number of bar organizations, but also community groups, like the Greater Harlem Chamber of Commerce, the West Harlem Development Corp, and other organizations. And you founded something called the Initiative, which we'll discuss in a moment. But first, why, with your seems like to be an extremely busy life, why do you get so involved? Why is it important to do this sort of thing in the community?
Well, that's where he started from. And I grew up with parents and relatives that were always community activists. They joined organizations, they led organizations. Um, and it's really something that I grew up with throughout my entire family. We don't have enough time, but my family on both sides is really unbelievable. But it's just part of who I am. And you should never forget where you came from. I tell people, I tell young attorneys, I said I've had the opportunity to deliver meals, deliver Kentucky Fried Chicken box lunches to poll workers on election day, and also to argue for candidates at the Court of Appeals. That spectrum of experience is everything. You get elected because for the people from the clubs, okay? You get elected from the people that do the work. And so if you forget that, then you're going to be lost. At one time, you're going to need them, and they're going to remember how after you use them, you turn their back on them. And that doesn't fly with me. I wasn't raised that way, and quite frankly, I'm very comfortable. I'm very comfortable with it. Giving back. I've had a blessed life. You got to give back.
Right. No, I mentioned the initiative. What is it?
Oh my God. So I founded this actually. I founded a organization called the Initiative, and my original purpose of it was to educate and to initiate, educate, and to assist formerly incarcerated in restoration of their civil rights. Okay, when you not so much with misdemeanors, but with felonies, you lose all your rights. One of the rights that you lose was the right to vote. Okay, but what happened was is that so we were pushing on that, and what happened was then it came down to where Governor Cuomo issued pardons. I'm sorry, if you had a felony conviction, you couldn't vote. If you were released and on parole, you still couldn't vote. Okay, so what happened was eventually Governor Cuomo signed a bill where he pardoned everybody who was on parole solely for the purpose of allowing them to vote. The laws of the state of New York, that mission continued, have now been changed to where the only way that you are not allowed to vote is if you are currently incarcerated pursuant to sentence.
Mhm.
So if you've been convicted but haven't been sentenced yet and you're being held, you can vote even though you've been convicted. The program I went, and by the way, I did this in conjunction with New York County lawyers. And I have to give a shout out to Anthony Bova, who is general counsel of New York County lawyers. I call her my partner in crime. She has been with me from the beginning, and we've been everywhere. We've done church basements, we've been to Rikers. Okay, I've been to Otisville, restoration of these rights. So now, today, we have all of these people that are on parole that now know they're eligible to vote. And they come out and vote. And in many of these elections, 100 votes here, 500 votes there makes all the difference in the world. I've worked with Fortune Society, I've worked with all of these organizations, and it has continued. Also, judiciary law says that if you have been convicted of a felony, you can't serve on a jury. But that's not true. You can serve on a jury if you receive a certificate of relief or a certificate of good conduct. And once you receive that, then the commissioner of jurors is the sole determinant of whether or not you are qualified to serve on a jury.
Really, I didn't know that.
Oh, most people don't. I had 40-year experience criminal attorneys that didn't know any of this, but I know it. And it's one of the things we do. So I have people volunteering. We assist them in applying for their certificates of relief and certificates of good conduct. I became part of the Clean Slate Coalition, and that now has become law. The governor signed it into law. It takes effect in November, which will be sealing records, which was another great impediment to, coming out and re-entry into society once you've done your time.
So ultimately, the goal of the initiative is to re-enfranchise people who've been disenfranchised.
Absolutely. That's the perfect description. Perfect description.
Ted, I'm getting a sense that if I asked you what advice you would give to young people who want to follow the Tingling family trail and legacy, you tell them that life isn't a spectator sport.
Huh.
Is that accurate?
It's very, very accurate. I'm like Gibbs on NCIS. I got all these rules, my own personal rules. But one of my rules is the hardest thing in life is making decisions because you're either right or you're wrong. But if you don't make a decision, You think that you're out of it. You're not. A decision will get made for you. Okay. And that is why you get involved. Okay. You get involved to see it for yourself so that you're not just hearing from this side or that side. It allows you to make what I believe would be an informed decision. And I go back to my rule: make decisions, because if you don't, they'll get made for you. Get all the information you can and make a decision. You're either right or you're wrong. But I'd rather I do that than someone else do it.
I think that's what Yogi Berra was saying when he said, when you come to a fork in the road, take it.
Yeah, exactly. How many people just stop? So many people stop. Or how many times, John, how many times do you hear, oh, I'm not involved, okay? Or I'm not interested. And then you think it doesn't affect you, but it does. It really does. So, you know, and again, and my other one was make friends, not enemies. You don't have to make them, they are out there. You have enemies you don't even know. So,
What a great way to sum it up. Judge, thank you so much for your service, your history, your family, and your time today.
John, thank you so much.